By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing under the pressure of advancing Allied armies. For years, the German military had fought across Europe, but now the situation had completely changed. Allied forces were pushing from the west, while the Soviet army advanced from the east. German cities were heavily bombed, and the country's defenses were rapidly weakening. The capital city of Berlin soon became the center of the final battle. Soviet troops surrounded the city while fierce fighting erupted in the streets. Buildings were destroyed and chaos spread across the city as the war reached its final stage. Inside Berlin, German leaders realized that defeat was inevitable. The once powerful Nazi regime was now facing its final days, and the world was about to witness the end of one of the most destructive conflicts in history. By early 1945, Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win. The Allied armies had already liberated many European countries that had once been under Nazi control. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces were pushing deep into Germany. At the same time, the Soviet Union launched massive offensives from the east, capturing city after city as they moved toward Berlin. German soldiers were exhausted and supplies were running dangerously low. Many military units were unable to resist the overwhelming strength of the Allied armies. Bombing raids continued destroying factories, railways, and military bases across Germany. As the Allied forces closed in from both sides, it became clear that the war in Europe was nearing its end. The once powerful German war machine was collapsing under the weight of the massive Allied advance. In April 1945, the Soviet army launched the final offensive against Berlin. Millions of Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery units, moved toward the German capital. The battle that followed became one of the largest and most brutal urban battles of World War II. German troops, including remaining army units and volunteers, attempted to defend the city. However, the Soviet forces were overwhelming in number and firepower. Fierce fighting erupted in the streets as soldiers battled for control of buildings, bridges, and intersections. Tanks rolled through ruined streets while artillery shells exploded across the city. Civilians were trapped in the middle of the conflict as Berlin slowly turned into a battlefield. The fall of the German capital was now only a matter of time. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Adolf Hitler retreated into a heavily protected underground bunker beneath the city. The bunker became the final headquarters of the Nazi leadership during the last days of the war. From inside the bunker, Hitler and his remaining commanders attempted to coordinate Germany's collapsing defenses. However, the situation outside was rapidly deteriorating. Soviet troops were fighting their way through the streets of Berlin, capturing key locations one by one. Communications with German military units became increasingly unreliable as the city was destroyed by artillery fire and bombing. Inside the bunker, tension and fear spread among the remaining Nazi officials. Many of them understood that Germany was now facing inevitable defeat. As the Soviet army advanced deeper into Berlin, the Nazi leadership began to collapse. Many German officials realized that the war was lost and began fleeing the city. Military commanders struggled to organize any meaningful resistance against the overwhelming Soviet forces. Inside the bunker, Hitler continued issuing orders to military units that no longer existed. Entire divisions had already been destroyed or captured during the final battles. German supply lines had collapsed and reinforcements were impossible. The once powerful Nazi government was now falling apart under the pressure of total defeat. As the fighting in Berlin intensified, the final days of the Third Reich were approaching. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the center of Berlin, Adolf Hitler made his final decision. Realizing that Germany's defeat was unavoidable, he remained inside the bunker while the battle raged above. That day, Hitler took his own life inside the underground command bunker. News of his death spread quickly among the remaining Nazi leadership. Without Hitler, the Nazi government was effectively finished. German officials attempted to negotiate surrender with the Allied forces to end the war in Europe. Meanwhile, Soviet troops continued advancing through Berlin, capturing government buildings and military positions across the city. The fall of Berlin was now certain, and the war in Europe was reaching its final moments. After the fall of Berlin and the death of Adolf Hitler, the remaining German leadership realized that continuing the war was impossible. German forces were surrounded on all sides by advancing Allied armies. In the West, American and British forces had crossed deep into Germany, while Soviet troops controlled Berlin and much of eastern Germany. German military commanders began negotiating with the Allied forces in order to end the fighting. Cities across Germany were heavily damaged, and millions of civilians had already suffered from years of war and bombing. The remaining German government knew that surrender was the only option left. As negotiations continued, the world waited for the official announcement that the war in Europe was finally coming to an end. On May 7, 1945, German military officials officially signed the documents of unconditional surrender to the Allied forces. The surrender agreement meant that Germany would stop all military operations across Europe. The following day, on May 8, 1945, the surrender became fully effective. This historic moment marked the official end of World War II in Europe. After nearly 6 years of devastating conflict, the fighting across the continent finally came to an end. For millions of soldiers and civilians who had endured the war, the announcement brought relief and hope for peace. The defeat of Nazi Germany marked the collapse of the regime that had started one of the most destructive wars in human history. When the news of Germany's surrender spread across the world, massive celebrations erupted in many countries. In cities across Europe, people gathered in the streets to celebrate the end of the war. Soldiers embraced civilians while church bells rang across towns and cities. In the United States and the United Kingdom, millions of people celebrated victory in Europe Day, also known as VE Day. After years of fear, destruction and sacrifice, the war in Europe had finally ended. However, the global conflict was not yet completely over. Fighting continued in the Pacific against Japan for several more months. Still, the surrender of Nazi Germany marked a major turning point and brought the world closer to the final end of World War II.